Professor Mangott, hi.
Hello.
Grüß Gott. Thank you very much for your time. I know that you're very, very busy, and I personally come to Innsbruck, to your university, to your Institute für Politik und Wissenschaft. First of all, I want to thank you for your objektive Meinung, for your opinion, which you gave about the current situation in the European Union and war in Ukraine. I know it's very difficult for Austrians and for the experts from the West to be objective in some aspects. However, you are very professional, and that's why I collected several questions, which I think helps us to understand better the situation. My first question concerns the war, the prerequisites and the reason of the war, because everybody now speak about the future steps by Russia, and everybody forget what were before the war. No? So who did wrong? What were the reason why they were stopped? The 24th of why the war began on the 24th of February. What was the reason?
Well, the interesting thing is that we do have two very contradictory narratives. We have the Western narrative, particularly in the United States and Britain, that the West has had open arms to Russia for the past 30 years, and the West is not to blame for the situation we are in now. The Russian narrative is the only thing we actually failed to understand is that we cannot trust you. They don't see that they have done some mistakes over the past 30 years, taken some decisions which actually transformed the initially very positive relationship between the West and Europe into something which is dominated by alienation.
And the Western narrative?
The Western narrative is that we had open arms to the Russian side. We welcomed Russia in the Western community, in the Western institutions, but they didn't accept because they don't want to accept our rules, our norms, our institutions. That's the Western narrative. But actually we need to be sober in the academic research, namely to really analyze with great professionalism and objectivity who made which steps at the wrong time in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. And in the academic field, as in politics, we now have the tendency that they only blame Russia for the war. Of course, Russia is the aggressor. The invasion is illegal. And of course, there are no serious grounds for Russia to start this invasion. But the whole picture, the grand picture, needs to analyze who has contributed what to this development. And here I do see that the West has made some mistakes, mm-hmm. and the Russians have made mistakes as well. In the Russian political arena, they stress two reasons for the invasion. Mm-hmm. First, they say it's an act of self-defense, which is ridiculous because they argue that Ukraine was about to attack Russia, mm-hmm. or Ukraine would be used by the West to attack Russia in the future. So self-defense is one of the reasons given by the Russian side why they had started the invasion. And the second reason was that we had sort of a genocide in the Donbass, which actually we cannot see as a genocide in the proper sense of the word. But when we talk about the real reasons for Russia's intervention, we need to address this revanchism, this revisionism among Russia's top political elite, particularly in the security apparatus. They want to restore traditional Russia, and they do not accept that Ukraine is an independent country, because their position is Ukraine actually is an artificial creation, very much pushed by the Bolshevik Soviet Union, but never had existed as a state, as an independent state before. And their position is that in Ukraine now we have territories that actually belong to Russia. They should not belong to Ukraine. So this revisionism and this revanchism on the Russian political elite side is very, very relevant. But what is also relevant and is discounted by almost all Western academics is that the expansion of NATO has made a contribution to the Russian decision to invade as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's what Henry Kissinger told a lot of times when he always spoke about that the expansion should not be to the
yes.
West. It was a part of the American even academic
yes.
path, not
Think about George F. Kennan, the famous diplomat and scientist who said in 1997 in an op-ed in the New York Times that expanding NATO is a mistake of epic proportions, so he said. So I do think it played a role. It does not play the dominant role, or is not the dominant reason why Russia has launched this attack, but we cannot discount it. As almost everyone in the West, in the political and the academic arena, is now saying, it had no influence at all. That's currently the Western position.
Professor Mangott, you have already explained artificial pretext for the war from the Russian side. And what is the role, this is actually my next question, what is the role, the future role, the current role of European Union, of NATO, and some other players in this map, in this regional situation? What are the interests and what can be the next steps?
Well, on the face of it, the European Union has a consolidated consensus position. This consensus was also needed, of course, to impose 8 packages of sanctions, which could only be passed through unanimity. But if you look closer at the individual member states of the European Union, you see that there are differences in their positions. I'd like to identify 2 camps. There is the camp of Eastern Europeans, Poland, the 3 Baltic republics, Romania, plus some Nordic countries and the United Kingdom, who fully support the Ukrainian government's official effort, namely to kick out Russian soldiers from the whole of the internationally recognized border and territory of Ukraine. So what they do is arguing we need to give the Ukrainians all the weapons they need, all the financial resources they need, all the political and diplomatic support they need to achieve that goal. The second camp is made up, as I see it, by the French, the Germans and the Italians, to name just the 3 dominant powers in Western Europe. They are more careful, I'd like to say. They fear that following such a maximalist goal could lead to an escalation of the war, either horizontally, namely that other countries will get involved in this war, or vertically, meaning that Russia might, facing a strategic defeat in this war, might resort to the use of nuclear weapons. So out of fear of such an escalation, horizontal and vertical, these governments actually are more, and they actually, behind the official facade, argue that the Ukrainian government should moderate its war aims. And even some of them go so far to argue that the Ukrainians will have no other option but to make territorial concessions, which of course is not actually possible with the current Ukrainian government and the current Ukrainian population, because a majority of Ukrainians, more than 90%, refuse to give any territorial concessions to Russia, which I fully understand.
So you see that there is a split meaning and the decision about the future and the current situation inside the European Union?
Yes, I do.
And what is about NATO?
Well, you know, 21 members of the European Union are also members of NATO, so we have this dividing line also by and large within NATO. But of course, what is different with NATO, of course, is that it includes the United States. And what I do see is that in the United States we have an internal debate how to continue. We have politicians and academics who push for the maximalist agenda, and then we have others. Think about the Joint Chief of Staff, General Milley, who is closer to the Western European position to urge Ukrainians to accept negotiations now, at least about a ceasefire, if not for a peaceful solution, a long-lasting peaceful solution. Ukraine rejected. Not officially, Ukraine says we are ready to negotiate, but only if all the Russian soldiers leave Ukraine. The Russians say we are ready to negotiate, but only if the current reality on the ground is taken into account, meaning that the Russians say we will not leave those regions that we have occupied in Ukraine. So both sides say they want to negotiate, but actually there's no way for them to find common ground. And for Ukraine, actually, it's not very not very helpful at the moment to enter into negotiations, because they are on the military offensive, they have the military momentum. Doing negotiations now would actually help only the Russian side.
You analyzed and you give very, very accurate and careful estimation of the situation, and I agree with you on a lot of points. But what can be the next steps in such kind of situation? I don't want to analyze military situation. We are not military experts, and for military analytics we need every day, every hour information. But from the political, geopolitical, maybe regional point of view, what kind of steps can be done, and by whom, the next 6 months, 3 months, next year, what presumably would be?
Well, there are some Western countries who are trying to push the Ukrainian government into accepting negotiations with Russia. Others are clearly opposed to such an idea. I don't see that we will have negotiations, not even about a ceasefire in the next 6 months. I don't see it, because both sides still think they can achieve battlefield successes. The Ukrainian side does, the Russian side does as well. And as long as they think they can actually strengthen their negotiating position by acquiring more territory, the Russians more Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainians to get back some of the Ukrainian territory currently occupied by Russia, I don't see any ground for negotiations. And you know, all have sunk costs in this war. They have invested so much financially, militarily, human costs particularly, that they actually want to go forward with the war in order to achieve a result which actually makes all the costs that have been incurred acceptable. The Russians do it, the Ukrainians do it. So I don't see any negotiations in the future.
So it means the war?
The war will continue. The war will continue.
With all the consequences, infrastructure?
With all the destruction that the Russians are now imposing on the Ukrainian infrastructure and on Ukrainian civilians. I do think, however, that over the next months this cleavage inside the European Union and inside the West in general that I've identified before will deepen. And we will also in the open hear some statements by the various governments which are actually irreconcilable. Those supporting the maximalist goal and those who say, no, we should have only moderate aims in this war. So this will increase over the next months.
So the tension will increase inside all the countries who are very active in supporting Ukraine, and I think it also can make a negative consequences for the situation, because we don't see any signs for any kind of secret or not secret negotiations. My last question concerns the role of Austria. Austria always was officially a neutral country in foreign policy. However, Austria is a part of European Union. European Union supports Ukraine, and thank you for your government supporting the Vertriebenen and the displaced persons, the refugees, how we call. And I know that the Austrians, the people, the civil society helps a lot for Ukrainians. Thank you personally for this. However, what do you think about the future role of Austria, like an experienced country in this international dialogue? I would say, because always we were center of international dialogue. So, what opportunities Austria use in such complicated circumstances?
Well, you know, we have seen a very dramatic change in the policy of the Austrian government and the Austrian political parties vis-à-vis Russia and vis-à-vis Ukraine. For a very long period of time, Austria had this idea that Austria could be a bridge builder between the West and Russia as a neutral country, that the Russians actually accepted this role of Austria as a bridge builder, which was all illusionary, but this was the official position. Now, when the war started, the Austrian government has changed its position very, very distinctively. Now they have clearly identified who is the aggressor, and they publicly have sided with the victim, with Ukraine. And inside the European Union, Austria is not among those countries who try to block some sanctions on Russia for their own for their own for their own gains, like Hungary does. Yeah.
So the Austria, the government has the pro-Ukrainian position.
It has definitely a pro-Ukrainian position, and actually that makes it difficult for Austria to become a mediator. If you are not trusted by both sides, then you can't be a mediator. So an active political role for Austria in bringing the two warring parties together, I don't see. What Austria could offer as a neutral country is to have negotiations take place in Vienna at a United Nations seat where we have a lot of international institutions. Yes, that is something I can think of, but even that I don't think is very likely. In principle, Austria's neutrality will have to be discussed in the public by experts and politicians, but the current political parties are not interested in debating about the future of Austrian neutrality, because neutrality is very well accepted by the Austrian population. More than 80% want to stick to neutrality. So if a political party comes up with the idea of giving up neutrality, this is actually a kiss of death. They would lose elections if they push forward with such an idea.
It's a dangerous trend.
Yes.
Political life.
Me personally, I do support that Austria remains a neutral country, but we should take our defense seriously, which we have not done for the past 30 years, actually. Austria is unable to defend itself in case of an aggression, and this has to change.
That's why, so can we say that the war of Russia against Ukraine changed a lot of geopolitical, regional, and even internal politics and trends in the European Union?
Absolutely. I mean, what I want to also mention is in this brief conversation is that the main geopolitical winner of this war is the United States, because with the Ukrainians fighting against the Russians, with the serious Russian losses in the military sector, the loss of human lives, the economic impact of Western sanctions, Russia is getting weaker and weaker by the month. And so the Western, particularly the US support for Ukraine, means that the United States can do away with a peer competitor at very cheap cost. And that is why I do think that at the end of the day, the United States will be eager to have this war, to have a war that is going to continue. Because the longer the war lasts, the weaker Russia will become, and that is in the interest of the United States. And insofar, I think they are the greatest geopolitical winner.
I have a lot of questions to ask, but we have a very short time. Thanks for your answers. And my last question, following your pre-last question, I would say, is I agree about the consequences, the scale of the consequences of the war for the geopolitical situation, and you mentioned very important thing about the future weakness of Russia. It's obvious, but can this weakness change the political system in Russia in the nearest future? Do you see the prerequisites?
No, I don't think so. There will be no mass unrest in Russia. We have seen that over the past 9 months, because a majority of the population is apathetic, is passive. They will not actually go out to demonstrate on the streets against this war, and it's very risky and dangerous for Russians to demonstrate against the war or to take a position against the Russian war of aggression. So no mass revolt from below. And at the moment I don't see a palace coup scenario when people who are currently in the inner circle of of the Russian power center will try to kick Putin out and take over the position of the president of Russia, because that will only happen, as I see it, if Putin will face a disastrous defeat in this war in Ukraine, which might include even the loss of Crimea. And in such a scenario, when Russia loses so decisively, I do think a palace coup is likely. but we are far from that situation at the moment.
Thank you for your sincere answers. Thank you for your activity, for your objective mining, for your objective opinion. And I think in the future we will make much more bigger interview about the current situation, because unfortunately I agree with you that we don't see any signs of the fast ending of the war. That's why we are prepared for the long-term conflict and for long-term analysis.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.